Hello and welcome back to Well Not Aged Well. And this week I'm once again joined by Mathew Restall. And this week we are going to talk about the Aztec Empire. The last time, which was actually 2 years ago already, and I can't believe how time flew by this past 2 years because it feels like only yesterday we recorded an episode about the conquistadors and who came to they destroyed the Aztec Empire with talent contest. I'm sure we will talk a little bit about this today as well. But if you haven't, please do check out our episode. It's episode 139, where we discuss the conquistadors in and the fall of the Aztec Empire. We also had John Schwalron. I do forgive me, I don't remember the episode right on top of my head, where we talked about the Aztec religion. So I highly recommend that episode as well. But this week we're going to talk about a general episode on the Aztec Empire. But let's begin with the origins of the Aztec Empire. Where did it come from? And of course, I want to begin. Perhaps one of the biggest misconceptions about the Aztec is that Aztec is more of a modern name. They didn't really call themselves Aztecs. That they were called in what I believe academic term is the Triple Alliance. So let's talk about first of all, before we go into the origins of the Aztec and the rise of the Aztec, I want to talk about where the term the Aztecs come from and how they went from the Triple Alliance, which is also a really cool name, but how they went from the Triple Alliance to be known as the Aztec Empire.
Uh, yes, it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me back, Erland. And it's always a pleasure to talk about the Aztecs, one of my favorite subjects to talk about. And as you say, there's misconceptions about the name. But I would say there's misconceptions about almost everything to do with the
Mm,
Aztecs. And when we talk about the Aztecs, one of the first things to kind of establish up front is if we're going to talk about it right, if we're going to talk about the Aztecs in a way that might actually change how people see the Aztecs, or at least kind of challenge some of their preconceptions, the things that they know or think they know, then we kind of establish this principle that the field of Aztec studies um, and the popular perception of the Aztecs is absolutely filled, chock-a-block, top to bottom, with
mm,
misconceptions, misunderstandings, controversies, and arguments, and so on. I mean, I suppose you could say that about almost anything. We could get somebody on here talking about Alexander the Great, and they might say the
mm.
same thing. I think it's particularly true of the Aztecs, and I hope that we'll get to some of those things.
Yeah,
But it begins with the name, right? And now I actually I don't have a huge problem with the word Aztecs and the use of the term
mm,
Aztecs, which might surprise listeners who have heard me rambling on and ranting on about things before, because I do often argue that the names we use for things really matter, that the
yeah.
terms matter, and that there is no such thing as the wrong term or the right term. There's only a term that's being used
Mm.
that should always be subject to debate,
It's
whatever
like
it is.
if I made a comparison, it's like calling the Eastern Roman Empire, for example, the Byzantines. They never call themselves Byzantines. That's just a Renaissance idea. It's more like because they were Romans. It's like it's the same thing, really. The Aztecs never
Yeah,
called
it
themselves
is. It actually
Aztecs.
is. Yeah, it's very similar. And I think, and I suppose we had, Byzantium experts on. Some would say,
Mm.
look, it's fine. It's convenient for us, and we
Yeah,
know what we're saying as long as you make it clear to people that that's not what they call themselves. So
yeah.
that is the first thing with the Aztecs. They did not call themselves Aztecs. That was a term that originates in the 18th century. So it comes several hundred years after the Aztec Empire ceased to exist. And it's just a convenient word that is that or a term that is used by us. I think where it gets kind of tricky is what comes after that in terms of
Mm.
what people how people use the term and how they deploy the term. And I
Mm.
there's many different directions we can go, but let me go in two, right?
Yeah.
Um, the first direction is um, in trying to make it use the correct term. People say, "Well, hang on a minute. Who were these people? What did they call themselves? Oh, they were the Mexica." Well, okay, that's true. So the capital city of Tenochtitlan was also called Mexico Tenochtitlan, or the full title was Mexico
mm,
Tenochtitlan. Honestly, we don't know if anybody, in the 15th century was going around saying, "Where are you going, mate? I'm going over the hill to
mm.
Mexico Tenochtitlan."
Yeah.
Well, we do know that co, at the end of the word Mexico, of course, that's the modern word Mexico or Mexico, that's a locative. So it means the place of the Mexica. So far, so good. But are the Mexica exactly the same as the Aztecs? Often you see that as a shorthand. In fact, in past publications of mine, I've taken that shortcut and said, oh, they're the Mexica, not the Aztecs. Um, and that's not really strictly true because the Mexica were the people who lived in Mexico Tenochtitlan, which was that island city. The people outside that city, on the banks of Lake Texcoco, the people in the city of Texcoco and other cities all around the lake, they were not Mexica. People who lived in the empire were not Mexica. I
Mm.
mean, there's a little bit of a parallel here with Rome that I do understand that there's a complex history of who the Romans were and who called themselves Romans, and that um, there was a time when Romans were only people who lived in Rome, and then as the Roman Empire expanded and so on, of course, at some point, I can't remember the name of the Roman emperor. Was it Caracalla or someone? I can't remember
Mm.
who ordained that
Yeah.
anybody
I
living
think it was Caracalla, yeah.
Caracalla within the Roman Empire would then be able to call themselves Roman. Okay, that's not what's happening here. There is no point at which the Mexica emperor, now he was the Mexica emperor, okay, but he was also the Aztec emperor. There's no point did
Mm.
he say, you're all Mexica, everybody within the empire is
Mm.
Mexica. So I think uh, that we
You're
have to be.
Mexica, you're Mexica, everybody is Mexica.
Yeah, and they're not saying that. So the Mexica was specifically the people at the heart of the empire, the people, the political
Mm.
and economic heart and
Mm.
capital of the empire. But that doesn't encompass all the people. The phrase Triple Alliance is also a modern invention. There's no evidence that in the 15th century people are referring to their empire as the Triple Alliance. I think that's a fairly safe one. I don't think anybody imagines that the Aztecs are going around calling their empire the Triple Alliance.
Did they call
It's
themselves an empire at all? Or is that more of a modern invention as well?
what was what word?
So I'm using Aztec to simplify it here, but did they call themselves an empire at all, or is that
No,
more of a
no.
European term?
No. So, right. So if you want to use a term that they use, there isn't really one that they use that we can translate, right? If
Mm.
there was a nice, convenient term, then obviously that would be the right one to use, even if it's unfamiliar to people. You hope you can kind of slowly change people's customs and habits and how they refer to it. So I think Aztec Empire is fine as long as it's made clear that they didn't call themselves Aztecs. All right, that's the
Mm.
first thing. The second thing is um, how far do we take that word, right? So Aztec Empire is a political unit.
Yeah.
Does that mean we can then talk about Aztec culture? Fine. Are we talking about Aztec political culture? That's fine too. But if you're going to extend that term to talk about everything the Aztecs are doing, their culture in its totality, you have to be mindful of the fact that Aztec culture, the so-called Aztec culture, is really Nahuatl culture.
Mm.
It's the culture of the people who spoke the language of Nahuatl, who lived in central Mexico. Um, they all pretty much all lived within the Aztec Empire. There are also many other people who spoke different languages and had slightly different cultures within the empire. Um, but their culture was really similar. So, if we want to get into at some point later on, Ellen, we will talk about
Yeah.
so-called human sacrifice. That's something that's kind
Mm.
of one of my pet peeves. These kinds of practices, these religious practices, were common throughout the empire and even in other regions of Mesoamerica outside the empire. So therefore, we
Mm.
have to be careful about the word Aztec in terms of culture. And then the last
Mm.
thing I want to say, I said I'd say two, and now I'm saying three. Um, the third thing leads me to something you mentioned right at the beginning about the origins of the Aztecs.
Mm.
Because where's the word come from? If it was invented in the 18th century, where did it come from? It comes from the town name or the place name, the toponym Aztlan, because according to Aztec mythology, the Aztec people came from Aztlan. Now, that has also been grossly misunderstood and taken very, very literally. So there's sources, Nahuatl language sources, sources created by indigenous peoples, that talk about the origin of the people being in the city of Aslan. Um, it seems pretty clear to me that this is origin mythology and is not to be taken literally. That there's not literally an actual place called Aslan, and that there weren't literally, you know, eight so-called tribes or groups of people of them that then wandered sort of through the desert, and down through northern Mexico, looking for the sign from their god that this was where the promised land was going to be,
mm,
and so on. I mean, this is the story, right? That they wandered looking for, and the sign was an eagle with a snake in his mouth landing on a cactus, on a rock, and there they
mm,
saw the island, in the middle of Lake Texcoco, the island that becomes Mexico Tenochtitlan. It's not to be taken absolutely literally.
mm,
And that's a problem when it is taken literally. That now in the Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., um, its early depiction of the Aztecs and their origins, and I emphasize early because this is a depiction you can no longer find. It's long gone. It's been completely changed. But early depiction actually had a map that showed Aslan being in Utah,
mm,
where the Great Salt Lake is. And then a little kind of, dotted line showing that the Aztecs coming from Utah then migrated down through northern Mexico until they found their city. So that to me was an extraordinary, literal interpretation of that mythology.
mm,
Totally problematic. I mean, I was fascinated to see it there. I hated to think of generations of American school children kind of going and seeing that and taking it literally. Um,
mm,
but because the flip side of it is, if there's anything I'm saying that sounds familiar to you, Erland, or to anybody listening who is familiar with the Bible and with Christian mythology,
mm.
or dogma, and not so familiar
Like
with
the
the
40
Aztecs.
desert walk, 40
Yes,
day, 40 years desert
exactly.
walk.
40 years wondering is that sounds
Yeah.
kind of familiar. Yes, of course it
Mm,
is. Because all of these sources on this mythology come from the colonial period. And yes, they're indigenous sources, but those indigenous peoples are Christian.
mm,
They're still indigenous. It's not, it's not
mm,
taking anything away from their indigeneity. But the fact is that, um, in the wake of the Spanish conquest and the establishment of colonization, the one thing that changes the quickest and the most significantly in the culture of indigenous peoples in Mexico, among the Nahuas and their neighbors, is religion. Other aspects of the culture don't change or don't change as quickly, right? The clothing changes a little bit, their language stays the same, a lot of the other practices, but anything to do with the religion, that changes. That's ultimately
mm,
what the colonists, the Spaniards care
mm,
about, as long as people are paying tribute, performing their labor obligations, and they are
mm,
Christian, then that's what they care about. So
mm.
this is clearly a mythology that is imbued with Christianity and Christian ideas, and how
Yeah.
we separate those things out is very difficult, and I'm not sure we even
Mm,
should. I think that's a mythology that is perfectly well understood, not as pre-Christian Aztec mythology, but as a colonial period understanding
mm,
of the origins of the Aztecs. So now you're saying, well, great. Well, then where did the Aztecs come from if they didn't come from Utah? I think that story is, a manageable, understandably simplified myth historical version of a very complex historical reality in which peoples are migrating for hundreds. And in fact, really, if we kind of go back and zoom back and look at the big picture, thousands of years, they're migrating down from the United
mm,
States across northern Mexico until they get to central Mexico. And they find this valley, which is one of the most fertile valleys in all of the world. And it's the most fertile place that any human beings are going to encounter as they work their way down from let's do big pictures from, coming from Siberia across the Bering Strait and through Alaska and down there. They get to Mexico City, what we think of Mexico City, the Valley of Mexico, that area. Of course, they're going to want to stay there. So there are going to be waves of migrants coming into that valley, um, generation after generation, century after
Mm,
century. The ones that happened to be there when Europeans showed up were, let's call them the Aztecs.
mm,
So, you want to pass a story on from generation to generation of the origins of your people. Um, is there really an understanding of the deep historical waves of migration? I don't think so. I mean, Europeans didn't have that kind of sophisticated understanding of their origins. But there was some kind of sense. There's a sort of collective memory, right, all over the world of
mm,
where people come from and the kind of challenges they've faced in migration and so on. And you turn that into a story. And so
mm.
there was a story of some kind that then got passed into the colonial period and got merged with biblical
Yeah.
stories of migration, of the promised land, of God promising you that there was a place for you if you
Mm.
keep going, and there it is. So yeah, I mean, listen, here we've got like 10 minutes in. You asked one question. The word Aztec
No, don't worry. I love it. I love it.
opens everything up.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, Aztec studies there's almost nothing that we can talk about that
Mm.
if we had a panel of 10 people who studied the Aztecs, that we wouldn't all be having a great argument about.
Mm. So how do they develop into what we and again I'm trying to simplify like I said earlier about like the Byzantines is really the Eastern Roman Empire or Romans as I try to say. I'm gonna call them Aztecs from now on just to because that's the most popular conception of the what we know them as. So how do they develop the society that we know and think of the Aztecs as up until the time of Moctezuma. So how do they develop into the pyramids, temples, and the cities around like Tenochtitlan? Sorry if I was for saying that,
No,
slaughtering
just
that.
just
Yeah,
fine.
but
Yeah,
how do they end up developing into the society that we know as and think of
right,
as the Aztec society?
right. Well, they did not invent all that themselves. Right? They did
Yeah.
not invent it. And you mentioned Byzantium, and the Byzantine Empire. It's actually, I mean, these comparisons obviously get us into trouble pretty quickly, but
Mm,
it's not a bad one because if you're talking about Byzantium, you can't talk about it without talking about the Roman Empire, meaning the Western Roman Empire, right?
mm,
You
mm,
you just can't. And so it's the same with the Aztecs, is you can't really talk about the Aztecs and their culture. And you mentioned,
mm,
um, this spectacular city with pyramids and temples. So let's talk about city planning, architecture, religion, and so on. All of that is all inherited by the Aztecs from the people that were in that valley before. So there's a great cultural tradition that goes back hundreds of years. We don't even know how far back it goes, right? Because every century that we go back, the ones closer to us kind of act as sort of filters. So we can't see how far back it goes. I mean,
mm,
the work that's been done archaeologically shows that well, we understand the Aztec Empire being roughly 100 years old when Spaniards showed up, but the kingdom before it, let's just say the kingdom of the Aztecs before it became an empire, goes back another 100 years. But this is from
mm.
historical sources of the colonial period that say, well, so the Aztec, um,
I think most people kind of date the Aztec Empire from say 13th, 14th century until like the Hernan Cortes arrived in the 16th
right.
century, something like that.
So sometimes, right. And so sometimes people imagine, okay, so that means then when it's founded, that's when they're kind of inventing this culture. That's when they're
Mm,
creating it. That's when
mm,
they're coming up with the idea of, these pyramids and so on. No, there already people were there, right? There's no reason for us to believe that that island was uninhabited, right? That there
yeah.
really was an empty island covered in stones, and there was an eagle landing on the cactus, and they somehow, what did they do? Swim
Mm,
out there, borrowed a few canoes, and out they went. No, there have been not only people living there and kingdoms, but empires.
Mm,
empires before, and we know about the Toltec Empire that was based in Tula, which is a little bit to the north of Tenochtitlan. We know about Teotihuacan, which is
mm,
right there in the valleys, not that far away, and that takes us back hundreds and hundreds of years. So we know about those, but clearly, even before then, and in between then, are political arrangements and a culture that never goes away. So we're talking about, millions of people there, continual inhabitation, and the passing on of these cultural traditions that are gradually evolving.
mm.
So what we see in the Aztecs is merely the latest manifestation of all of
Yeah.
this at the time the Europeans arrive. And if we had not, if Europeans hadn't, so you see, we like it was somehow, our ancestors, Germans and English, obviously it's
Mhm.
not. But if Europeans hadn't shown up in the 16th century, I mean, this is the thing that sort of is one of the most mind-blowing and kind of frustrating things for me, trying to imagine what would have happened. You know,
Mm,
how long, how would this culture have evolved? I think the Aztec Empire would have expanded south into the Maya area and become really much larger and would have created
mm,
colonies among Maya kingdoms and possibly overextended itself. And at that point, then begun to kind of collapse in. So there's another kind of perhaps another
mm.
100 years of Aztec imperial history. At which point, what happens after that? Well, typically, what happens in Mesoamerica is the same thing that happens in
In
Africa,
Europe.
East Asia, and in Europe. You get a period of warring states, as it's called in Chinese
Mm,
history, but you get lots of smaller states
mm,
battling against each other, and then gradually a new imperial arrangement emerges. And that's
mm,
what would have happened. And most likely, the capital of that arrangement would have been somewhere in central Mexico, because that's what had happened for, 1,000 years or more before the Aztecs. So we can kind of trace and predict what would have happened. And uh, it's fun. It's not perhaps the most rigorous scholarly activity to try and predict the Aztec future, but I think it's perfectly valid because it helps us to understand, where the Aztecs came from and how they evolved. If we sort of think about how they would have evolved after that.
mm. So the next thing I want to talk about is Aztec warfare because and I haven't read John Schwaller, and I would highly recommend reading his book and as well checking out our episode with John Schwaller where we talked about the Aztec religion in a more broader perspective. We're going to touch on this today as well, of course, but from my understanding, and it's more that while Europe and say African empires focused on warfare as a form of territorial expansion, and think this is not just the Aztecs, but also let's say the Mayans, for example, they were focused on wars for slavery and for human sacrifice. And we discussed this with Jonathan Schwaller as well, where if you were pretty much safe if you were a citizen of the Aztec Empire. You weren't gonna, no one would gonna come and knock on your door and say, "Hey, you are our next victim for a human sacrifice." But most of the people sacrificed were slaves from taken as prisoners from warfare. It was not necessarily about territorial expansion per se, but it's more to capture slaves and for human sacrifice. So let's talk a little bit about how warfare worked in the Aztec Empire.
Well, so I'm sort of agreeing a little bit with what you're saying now, and then I'm kind of disagreeing, um,
Mm.
which is part of the fun. So,
That's why you're here.
yeah, so I absolutely agree. I mean, it's not really about territory. That's not that for us to understand the Aztec Empire, we must not think of it as a traditional territorial empire. So this is not an empire in which, say, a conquered zone will then be
Mm.
governed by a governor sent from the center.
And
This is not
again,
an
do forgive me for doing so many analogies this episode, but kind of like in a sense, kind of like the Holy Roman Empire, right? It was more principalities in a way, not like you said, not from one emperor, but
yeah.
it's more or less principalities. So in a way, it's kind of like the Holy Roman Empire of the
In a way,
German.
it's a
Yeah.
little bit more like the Holy Roman Empire than the actual Roman Empire.
Hmm.
Although, um, I mean, the Holy Roman Empire is not very, it's not very clearly centrally run. So
Mm,
we get into trouble with that one. But yes, you're right in that sense. And this is also not an empire in which a conquered area is then going to be colonized. There aren't going to be settlers sent from the center. Now, there are some exceptions. In both cases, there are some exceptions where there appear to be um, governors or sort of permanent emissaries of some kind who are sent out to conquered provinces. There are examples of garrisons of soldiers,
mm,
warriors out in other provinces, and also small colonial settlements. So there are exceptions, but so we shouldn't sort of talk about these things as absolutes. But generally speaking, it isn't an empire like that. Involving territorial expansion and everything that implies. Where I'm going to disagree with you is about human sacrifice, and
mm,
I'm going to kind of put a pin in that phrase because I have a real
mm,
problem with the phrase, and I no longer believe that we should be using that phrase without putting it in scare quotes or a kind of an understanding of um, what a loaded, judgmental, and misleading phrase that is. But let's just put that aside for now. What kind of empire is it? It's a tribute empire. The purpose of expanding the empire, of sending armies to a region, is to subdue that region, and in the resulting peace agreement, treaty, to use terms that don't have very good equivalents in Noah, but the understandable to us. The resulting arrangement is that that region then pays tribute, and they pay tribute on a calendar, on a schedule, and the schedule is 4 times a year. And there's a moment every 3 months when tribute comes in from all over the empire into Tenochtitlan, and all the provinces of the empire pay their tribute at the same time. So every 3 months you have these kind of massive festivals in the city where the emissaries from all over the empire bring in and deliver their tribute into Tenochtitlan, um, on which there's this kind of a celebration of empire. There's a celebration of Tenochtitlan's role at the center of this universe, because of course there's also people are coming in too. That these are essentially embassies coming in, reaffirming that they are honoring the arrangement that has been made, and then delivering all their tribute goods, which are all tallied and counted and so on. And then some of those goods are then passed out to other parts of the empire. They come in and then they go back out, based on kind of the hierarchy within the empire. And and you mentioned Triple Alliance before, what does that mean? But there's the second and third city, Texcoco and Tlacopan, that
mm,
today is Texcoco and Tacuba, but let's call them Texcoco and Tlacopan, and those are the second and third cities. So, there's a little bit of resentment, perhaps, among them that everything is first of all goes to Tenochtitlan, but they do
mm.
participate in the bounty. So it's a redistribution of resources that reflects the hierarchy within the
Yeah,
empire. What if you don't show up? What if you decide not to?
yeah,
You come up short on your tribute and you don't come in. Well, I sometimes I have students say, well, it's kind of like the Aztecs, they're kind of like mafioso, right? I'm like,
mm,
okay, you gotta be careful with that because first of all, there's a lot of kind of negative racist stuff in America about Italian Americans and
yeah.
the mafia and so on. But is it kind of a little bit of a protection racket? I would not write that or
Like an offer you
or let
can't
that be
refuse.
printed. Yeah, I mean, but we can talk about it. It's like in the sense that why are they continuing to pay the tribute, making the payment? Because if they don't, someone's going to come and beat them up. Yes.
Mm,
Then the warriors march out of Tenochtitlan and march out to the province. And then there's violence. And so it's the threat of violence that keeps the empire, that holds the empire together. Um, and in that sense, it's a tribute empire. All right. So you mentioned slaves and people
mm,
being executed and so on. Um, so all of these festivals do not involve people being executed. So,
mm,
so it's not the most common thing is not when you bring your tribute in that you're also bringing, say, people who are enslaved and then they're going to be, you know, executed. And I
mm,
certainly would take issue with the idea that, oh no, they have to be, sacrificed or whatever. Those kinds of executions generally stem from the period of warfare. So there's a war season, and that's
mm,
roughly kind of the end of our year, kind of November, December up until about May.
mm,
And the rest of the time is, the people who are fighting are involved in mostly in agricultural pursuits. So there's a war season, everybody honors that. When the
mm,
Spaniards show up, they don't. And that's part
mm,
of the massive disruption of the Spanish Aztec War or the conquest of Mexico, whatever we want to call it, is that Spaniards are not honoring the war season, and therefore um, their arrival is going to end up creating a whole series of famines and crop failures and crop
mm,
shortages and so on. So there's a war season, and during
mm,
the course of the war season, those monthly festivals are more likely to feature prisoners of war being executed.
mm.
That's
If I
not,
may chime in, what was
yes.
there only human sacrifice or was there animal sacrifice as well, or were humans the only way they sacrifice people?
Yeah. So the problem I have with the phrase, let's just go to the phrase. The problem I have with the phrase human sacrifice is that it's a very, the phrase carries an enormous amount of baggage. It is a phrase,
Yeah.
it's like the word tribe, is that it's only applied to non-Western peoples or particularly
Mm,
let's say European peoples, but non-Western peoples. So, in the 16th century, or the 15th, 16th century, sort of the same kind of time as the Aztec Empire, and shortly after that, in Elizabethan England, people are being publicly executed
yeah.
in very elaborate ways, in which often involves long periods of torture prior to their execution.
I mean, think about the
Um,
Tower of London, for example.
yeah, I mean, people being flayed and cut and hung, drawn, quartered, people being burned alive at the stake. All of these kind of highly ritualized public
Yeah.
executions
Or the Wild
are being
West in
done.
the 1860s,
Yeah,
where
right.
hangings
And
were, yeah.
they're being done for political and religious reasons. I mean, if you think about burning at the stake in Elizabethan
Mm,
England, and under her predecessor, under Mary, that's because people are being killed in that manner. It's a public torturing until you're dead, for very, very overt religious reasons to do with the fact that you're not practicing the right kind of Christianity. It isn't even people of a different religion, but we don't call that human sacrifice. When
yeah.
you actually think about the circumstances of those killings and why they're being done and so on, and then think about what we understand of those kinds of killings that are taking place in Mesoamerica, because it's not just the Aztecs, right? Um,
Mm.
then it's
Mayans did
extremely
this as
similar.
well, maybe not to the same extent, but the Mayans did this as well, and I'm sure other tribes as well.
To a very limited degree, right? It's it's
Yeah.
it's it's an unusual thing, and we have to realize that Mayan history, we're talking about 3,000 years, and so
Mm.
what people tend to seize on one particular piece of art or one particular description, say, oh, this is what the Mayas did, right? There's a mural in Bonam Park of them pulling the fingernails out
Yeah.
of prisoners of war. It's like this is what the Mayas did. They they pulled the fingernails out of prisoners of war and they tortured them, and then and look at this, at Chichen Itza, there's this Chacmul sculpture. They put people over there and they cut their heart out. This is what the Mayas did. Um, that would be like saying, tell me about Elizabethan England.
Yeah.
Well, and all you're going to do is talk about people being burned alive at the stake, and you're never going to mention Shakespeare. But
Mm.
no, because what we do is we primarily associate Elizabethan England with Shakespeare
Yeah.
and culture, and we see it as this very kind of like, you know, oh, and the sort of progressive, the beginning of a sort of progressive politics that's going to then lead in the next century to the development of, parliamentarian rule and so on. All very, very positive, and we don't talk about human sacrifice
Mm.
There might
And
be
and
executions.
I don't know if you remember, but we discussed this the last time you were on as well.
I'm sure I
Where
ranted about it then too. Yeah.
where where that really we call them savages for doing human sacrifice. And to be fair, I don't want to suffer the what we think about as the Aztec human sacrifice because it was brutal. But the Europeans were equally as savages, like you said, with the burning of the stakes, or the notion of witchcraft, which still was kind of dying off at the time. But you had witches burned at the stake or religious persecution. They weren't much less savages than
Hmm.
the Aztecs at the time, and I think that's a good point to point out as well. That they were pretty much just, even though they felt more, and I'm gonna quote there, civilized. They weren't really as less savages than the Aztecs just because they had superior, maybe not even that much superior weaponry than the Aztecs.
Yeah, I mean, if let's sidestep to that, right? To talk about,
Mm,
um, well, just the word superiority and superior. I
mm,
think that differences between the Aztecs and the Spaniards were very quickly read by the Spaniards as being markers of superiority and inferiority.
yeah,
And I think that we have sort of inherited those attitudes. And even when we've decided to discard some attitudes because they don't fit our culture today. For example, the Spaniards said, look, we had the true religion and the real religion. They didn't recognize that there was religions other than Christianity. Those were just perversions of the devil, right?
yeah.
So he said, this is why we're here, because we were guided by God, and this justifies us being here because we have the true religion where we're saving their souls. And their so-called religion was just a kind of Satanism that had to be stamped out. Okay, so in our modern secular age, obviously we kind of would reject that as a marker of superiority, but we still cling to some of the others, right? Like, for
Mm,
example, we're talking about human sacrifice. It is astonishing how often you pick up books, and unfortunately books that sell well, that reach larger audiences, popular books in which there is a reference to the Aztecs. It may be a big part of the book, it might be a page, right?
mm,
In which the number one and often only thing that associated with the Aztecs is human sacrifice, and it is
yeah.
presented in terms so exaggerated as to effectively be completely invented, right? Like, oh,
Mm,
this is a society completely devoted to um, brutal, bloodthirsty rituals of tens of thousands of people being killed.
yeah.
Uh, these ideas, which are still so
But
common.
again,
Like,
to
oh,
go
they
back to
believed that
your,
the sun would
yeah.
not rise in the sky unless blood was offered to the gods, and so therefore you had to sacrifice all of these people
Mm.
in order to kind of keep the world turning and so on. This is all nonsense. This is all
And
dates from the colonial period.
again, go back to what you said earlier. How many people, like you said, burned at the stake for religious belief, or were captured by the Inquisition in Spain for being Muslims at the same time
Mhm.
period that this were going on? So who are the real savages here? You know
Right.
what I mean?
And we can actually any there's the list of brutal moments in human history where one people does something terrible against another people is very long, and there's no end to them, and we can find them from in I mean
And it
the
still goes on today.
what's going on today. Let's not get into about modern politics, but
Yeah, I'm
the
just saying.
violence in the Ukraine and Gaza.
Yeah.
Okay, so we therefore going to then condemn entire cultures and civilizations. Well, some people do want to do that, right? But
Mm,
as time goes by, we tend not to. Um, I mean, what was the something I was reading the other day? I think it was the anniversary of um, the massacre of Polish officers um, in the Second World War. Um, by Does it really matter who it was by? I mean, it doesn't. It doesn't. I think it was Russians captured all the officers of the Polish army. This is
yeah.
not my area of specialization, so I don't remember. But my point is that that was absolutely brutal
Yeah.
slaughter of unarmed people, does that therefore mean that forevermore we're going to kind of, think of the Russians as being, absolute savages? I mean,
Mm.
no. Yet some people might want to. Some will say, yeah, see, you can't. Now look what they're doing in Ukraine. The Russians they're just always savages. It's like part of their nature.
Mm.
I'm not in favor of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, but I wouldn't say the Russian people are savages. That's absurd.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just it's total sort of bigotry, and that's not a position that I would support in any way. And yet, that's how people treat the Aztecs. And not
Mm.
only do they do that, but based on moments of violence that are not well evidenced at all. So this idea that 80,000 people were sacrificed at the coronation of Ahuitzotl, who was an
Yeah.
Aztec emperor late in the 15th century, there is no evidence of that at all. It is completely invented in the 16th century. Very convenient invention, then repeated and repeated, and it ends up being repeated in sources written by
Mm.
indigenous peoples who, as I said, half an hour ago, were Christian, right?
Mm.
So it's very convenient for everybody because it allows people to think, oh, I'm glad I live now. And
Yeah.
instead of 100 years ago, when I probably me and all my friends and family would have been executed just because the emperor died and there's a new one coming onto the throne,
Yeah.
right? Makes you feel better about what's happened in it, and it makes you feel better about the fact that you're now Christian, right? Like, Aztec children are being, they're not Aztec children anymore, they're Nahua children are being brought up in the late 16th century, obviously to be socialized as Christians and to believe that now this is the right faith, the correct one. And in the past, our ancestors were deluded by the devil and they did all of these terrible things. But we can look back objectively and say, no, that's not really quite what happened. So the real story is not how terrible the Aztecs were, but how it comes about that
Yeah.
they have given this reputation, which is still maintained into the 21st century, as to being the most bloodthirsty, brutal, human sacrificey
Mm.
peoples of all time, right? That
Yeah.
that that's really the big question here, Erland. And I think we're kind of at the dawn, or maybe we're beyond the dawn, how kind of deep in the morning of a whole new era of Aztec studies. I made him thinking about it should be labeled, the new Aztec studies, or maybe the new Aztec and
Mm.
Maya studies, or the new Mesoamerican studies, because there's really kind of a momentum here, I think, of scholars and even writers working outside academia. Um, People, running podcasts who are beginning to realize that, oh, there's a really interesting story here, which
Yeah.
is to change how we see the Aztecs and maybe kind of unearth a far more
Yeah.
complex, sophisticated, realistic, accurate understanding of them as not being just completely out there and weird and this horrible savage kind of exception,
Yeah.
but actually being a lot more like, you know, oh, what a surprise,
They
other
were
human
humans.
societies.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
you mentioned
yeah,
the portrayal
exactly.
a little earlier about how, even just if it's just one page mention. I mean, again, we discussed this the last time you were on as well, but you know how most people portray the Aztecs by the sacrifice and the number of victims that came. But that's kind of what I think was it hasn't false, not get it wrong, but the world by Simon T. Montefiore mentioned this last time as well, is that he actually talked about this as well, that they weren't much different from European society at the time. They were really just kind of normal people, just with a few kind of the same rituals, or say in a way a similar society to that of Europe, minus some technology that they did not have that the Europeans had advantage of. So I think that really drove the credit to Simon Sebald Montefiore for actually mentioning that they were these brutal savages that history meant think that made them think we made us think they are, you know.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned technology, and that kind of takes us back to we started talking about superiority and weaponry
Yeah.
and so on. And that's a good thing a good topic to kind of come back to and sweep
Yeah.
up a little bit because um, yes, there are differences, and obviously the Spaniards had, for example, ocean-going ships.
Hmm.
I mean, that allowed them to get there in the beginning.
Yeah.
And so, from the Spanish point of view, this is a technology that made them superior. The
Hmm.
Aztecs had canoes. They've got like ocean-going vessels. Obviously, they're superior. Um, well, the
And,
so the
and
the, the
again,
count.
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but
No,
here's
please
another
do.
misconception, perhaps, because a lot of people think that the Aztecs thought that the Spaniards were gods because they had cannon fire, and they shot the cannons, and then they thought they were gods or something. I think, but they didn't really think they were gods, and then they realized that they had superior firepower, but with the cannons, but the muskets as well weren't really that reliable at the time as well. So how, I mean, we will talk about the Night of Noche Triste in a moment, but again, when people think about, how the Aztecs thought that the Spaniards were gods because they had cannons, that's kind of a ludicrous assumption, from my
Yeah,
understanding.
it's totally ludicrous. It's totally ludicrous, and human beings. There's no good evidence that human beings, in throughout history, when they have encountered another group of human beings from a completely, no, I
Yeah.
shouldn't say complete different culture, but from a different
Mm.
culture with different technology, that they have taken those human beings to not be human.
Yes.
That there's no evidence of that. That's simply not what people
If
don't
you
do.
want, if you want to speak ludicrous, you want to talk about the Christian belief that Prester John came from kind of the Mongol world or the Asian, where dragons and such
Mhm,
fantastical creatures. The medieval
mhm.
idea that there was a Prester John. That's ludicrous, if anything.
Yeah, I mean, and Europeans had these ideas and expected monstrous peoples and so on, and
Yeah,
they think they're still out there. But actually, when you really kind of look at the evidence, no one actually seriously claims that they, for example, went to an island and it was inhabited entirely by women
yeah,
who had one breast cut off so they
yeah.
could fire their bows and arrows. But they did say, well, I know that island exists because this other guy told me about it,
Hmm.
right? So,
I mean, I
you know,
wouldn't mind if Themyscira existed, to be fair.
no, I think the counter to the idea that the Spaniards are superior, just to start with, because they had the
Hmm.
ships and they crossed the ocean, and the Aztecs didn't build ships and cross the ocean to Spain, therefore the Spaniards are
Yeah,
better, right? Is the proper response to that is to look at why the Aztecs had canoes and why the Spaniards had ocean-going ships. So there's developments that are going on in these two cultures, a lot to do with the resources that are available to them and to the geographies of where they live.
yeah,
So the Aztecs had an incredibly sophisticated canoe culture because they lived on a lake. And their
yeah,
cities were surrounded by a lake. And so, what had they done that is impressive that is, if you want to talk about better or superior, they had developed superior technology for controlling the lake and water, for separating out salt water from fresh water. And the city that they built on that island was, if you want to use the word superior, superior to any city in Europe. It was better laid out,
mm,
cleaner, it was, the crisscrossing of the lake with, or of the island with roads and canoes, was simply a better way of constructing a city in the 15th century than the Europeans had done. Right. And why did they do that? Because
yeah,
why now am I trying to argue that Aztecs are superior to Europeans? No, it's about the setting, it's about the geography, it's about the human ability, human ingenuity in responding to the environment and the resources that are available to you. So that's where the differences come from. Oh, but the Spaniards are, they've got cavalry. Well, because they had horses. There were no
yeah,
horses in Mexico, in the New World, in the Americas. So, um, they used what was available to them. Oh, well, the Spaniards had guns. They got gunpowder. They didn't invent
mm,
gunpowder. Chinese invented gunpowder and it
yeah,
spread to Europe. It just hadn't spread to the New World. Well, it did in the 16th century, right? That's how things get spread. So it doesn't make the Spaniards better that they have or superior, they did have advantages. Although, I long ago in a much earlier book of mine, going all the way back to book called Seven Myths of the Spanish Conquest, I talked
Yeah.
about the weaponry and what was better and what wasn't, and so on. And in those early wars of the Spanish invasions, um, cannons are of limited use. They didn't have muskets. The musket hadn't been invented yet. And so they didn't have pistols or muskets. They only had arquebuses or a harquebus, which is a very inefficient weapon. And my favorite quote that I found was an old conquistador in the late 16th century called Vargas Machuca, who said, "You know what? The powder gets wet. By the time you reload, you only got one. You got one bullet, or not. They're not even bullets. Those haven't even been
Yeah.
invented yet. They're balls. You only got one, and by the time you reload it, the enemy is upon you." So really, the
Mm.
most useful thing you can do with an arquebus is hold it by the barrel and use it as a club.
So yeah, you were talking about how sorry, I had to take a little break there, but yeah, you were talking about how well, how the muskets were kind of not weren't really that developed yet as a weapon.
Yeah, and the weapon. I think we can go through all these weapons and
Mm.
talk about them as being of relatively limited use or limited advantage for the invaders, for the Spaniards, except I think the one exception is probably the steel sword. Um, that the Aztecs had these obsidian blades, or they had clubs and swords that had obsidian in them. It was really nasty, and they wounded Spaniards, and those wounds became infected. And most of the conquistador deaths come from those infections. So they're not sort of falling on the battlefield; they're just getting cut, and then they're dying not long after from infection. So those are very nasty weapons and have way more effect than you might imagine. But the steel sword is more dramatic because it's being swung and limbs are being severed and people are being run through with swords and so on, so they're dying more on the battlefield. So
Mm.
does that give Spaniards an advantage? I would say yes, it does. But um, also
They
we
did lose the Noche Triste when
yeah.
they so that's just go to show that even having superior weapons again, sorry for using the term superior, but that goes to show that necessarily having better weapons
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily. And again, I think it was the Zulu Wars. I don't remember which one, which African war it was that the Europeans lost against the Africans, but it goes to show that not every time having better weapons is necessarily gonna win you the battle by
Yeah,
any chance.
exactly. The circumstances have to be just right for that weapon to be deployed in the way
Mm.
that gives you an advantage. And the Spaniards are fleeing Tenochtitlan in the middle of the night in the rain. They've got arquebuses and swords. They've got horses. They've got war dogs or mastiffs. None of these offer them any kind of an advantage, and most of them are killed. Most of them
Yeah.
die. In fact, most of the Spaniards who come to Mexico during the Spanish Aztec War die. Um, and
Mm.
there's a whole idea that sort of 400 guys show up and conquer an empire of millions. It's completely wrong. Actually, there's thousands of Spaniards come, several thousand. And there's the list of sort of misconceptions and myths, right? We've already been kind of going
Yeah.
through some. No, they don't think the Spaniards are God. No, Cortez does not burn or sink his ship so no one can return. No, there aren't 400 guys who come and conquer an empire of millions. Um, and sometimes I say, actually, there was, I estimated something like 3,000 Spaniards crossed into Mexico during the course of the war. Then someone will say, well, that's still impressive. 3,000 guys conquers millions. And I said, wasn't 3,000, most of them died. So he said, so then
Yeah.
it's even more impressive. I'm saying, no, 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 no. I'm
And
just
often
pointing.
you have all these diseases that that Europeans bring in, or the diseases that they are not
They bring
familiar with,
diseases.
from
Yes.
and the diseases that the Aztecs may have that they get from the Aztecs again. So it's the both sides there that you have
Well, and
that people die
disease,
from.
right. And the point about disease is also one that's often misunderstood because people think they oversimplify it, say, oh, the Spaniards brought disease that to which the Spaniards had immunity, and
Yeah,
therefore the Aztecs are dying in huge numbers because they, through epidemics because they don't have immunity, and
yeah,
that gives the Spaniards an advantage. No, it doesn't work like that. Um, the Spaniards are never alone. Who are the Spaniards with? They're with indigenous peoples. They are outnumbered many, many, many times over by indigenous warriors and families and support personnel that are with them. Therefore, those people are going to be exposed to the diseases from the Spaniards more quickly even than the Aztecs. So, we're talking about the siege of Tenochtitlan, and yes, there's epidemics sweeping through this. In fact, it seems fairly clear that during that siege at the end of the war, um, the cutting off of access to food, so that therefore, the ability of people in the city to fight off disease and even to fight the invaders is compromised because they're starving, right? Their immune systems
mm,
are collapsing. Yes, that was an important factor, but um, that epidemic came from outside, and it was also spreading through, Spaniards' so-called allies. And if we
yeah.
look at the numbers of who was on each side of that
Also,
battle,
you have sexual disease because some of the Spaniards slept with some of the Aztec women that were there.
also causing
So yeah,
disruption, and yes, yeah. So, well over 90 and possibly up around, as much as 97% of people participating at the end of the war there, but leading up to the siege and the siege itself, 90, let's just say 90 to 97% of those people were indigenous,
yeah,
right? The Spaniards were just represented just a few percent of people fighting. So as soon as you look at that number, you go, oh, okay, that now changes how we see so many of these stories going all the way back to the beginning to what I just said of this myth of, oh, the 400 guys show up on the beach and then they conquer this empire of millions. But um, actually, those Spaniards represent a tiny percentage of people who participated in the war on both sides. You add up all
yeah,
those numbers together. So it does dramatically change how we see the war. And once we see the war differently, we see it as an example of an empire that kind of collapses in on itself. That forces us to then go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, Erland. It forces us to think differently about how the empire is structured,
yeah,
right? If that's the case, oh, okay. How is the empire structured then? Is it, do we go back to the mythology of, oh, the subjects of the Aztecs hated the Aztecs because
yeah,
they were such brutal people? It's like, no, that makes no sense. They all shared in the same culture. Did
yeah,
they want to throw off the tribute burden? Yeah, absolutely. But is that what's really happening? Which city states are playing the most important role in the war that results in the fall of
yeah,
Tenochtitlan? Well, traditionally, it's Tlaxcala, but that doesn't make any sense either because there aren't enough Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcalans, are there tens of millions of Tlaxcalans? No. It's the number two city state in the empire. It's Texcoco. It's
yeah,
very much a civil war. These are people who are not just sharing the same culture and are part of the same empire. They're even part of the same family. There are examples of brothers, a brother in Tenochtitlan and a brother in Texcoco, and they take different sides at the end of the war. So, looking at the war without all these um, outdated misconceptions about Spanish superiority and the amazing Spanish accomplishments.
mm,
Going beyond that or putting all of that aside allows us to better understand the nature of Aztec culture, the structure of the empire. Um, if you want, as a tribute empire, there's a kind of a weakness to that structure. Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, I'm willing to kind of talk about that as being an empire that is weakly structured, that is not structured in a way that it's going to be able to withstand an invasion from outside.
yeah,
Regardless of whether it's coming from. What if all the Maya kingdoms, of which how in 1520, how many were there? 30 or 40 Maya kingdoms. There'd never been an empire that had united the
yeah.
Maya region ever in thousands of years of Maya history. There've been attempts. There've been some pretty large kingdoms, but no empire. But what if
Mm.
um, a
And kind of like,
significant
again, I'm so sorry for doing many analogies, but there's kind of, there's never, as well, there's never been an attempt to unite India, for example.
Mm.
So it's kind of the same thing. There's been kingdom, and the Mughals are the last closest to have done that, but there's never been
Mm.
really been an attempt. So yeah, I get what you're saying there.
Yeah. Well, the Mughal Empire covered what, maybe half of
Yeah,
India, maybe some, and
yeah,
I don't know for sure, but yeah. So what if a Maya kingdom had become large enough and strong enough and close enough to being, a Maya empire, and then attacked the Aztecs? I think the Aztec empire would not have been structured well in order to be able to withstand that kind
yeah,
of invasion. So, and that made me seem like an absurd kind of line of argument. But my point is to get away from the notion of Spanish or Western superiority, and kind of to think more deeply about how the empire is structured, and how it's
yeah,
structured in a way that works for for the environment. That you can't expect the Aztecs to think, well, over the ocean there, maybe there's other continents, and people
yeah,
might come in big ships and attack us. So we really need to rethink how we've
yeah.
structured the empire. It's absurd to imagine them thinking along those lines, right? So
Mm.
it's a structure that works within the confines of what they know of the sort of the universe
Yeah.
that's known to them.
And do forgive me if I'm drawing a little bit over time, but I do want to talk a little bit about the book as well, when Moctezuma met Cortez, because you talked about some, but I want to bring it up at the end of the episode, because in the book you talked about how European perceptions in both opera, theater, and etc. has been portraying the Aztec Empire, and I want to talk a little bit about how history has portrayed the Aztecs in the aftermath, and it's only recently in the 21st century. And I still think most of the majority still think of the Aztecs as a kind of these murderous, brutal savages
Mhm.
that, even to the 21st century, to this day, people, but your book also but make talk about how, operas and plays and how various media portray the Aztecs. So let's talk a little bit about how the world has perceived the Aztecs in the aftermath. That's and again like
Yeah,
your book when Moctezuma met Cortez is really about.
I think that's a good place to kind of bring things to a close, because um, it connects us all the way up to the present, right? And
Yeah,
there's a question implied here is, well, if our understanding of the Aztecs is so wrong and is so deeply rooted in what the conquistadors said in the 16th century, how has it survived 500 years? Um, why is it only now that we
mm,
are beginning to kind of see this differently? Like,
yeah.
what has been going on during those hundreds of years? And the
Is
simple
it simply
answer,
the racist propaganda that is
well,
being
what's
portrayed?
been going on is European imperialism.
Yeah,
So, European imperialism is in the 19th century is a completely different beast than it was back in the 16th century, when it's really just beginning to get going. The peak of European imperialism is what, right before the First World War, takes us into the early 20th century, in which then European empires now are encompassing almost the entire globe. And so it's not coincidental that in the 19th century, it's the 19th century, which is the great age of European empires and the development of ideologies to support those empires. It's not coincidental that that is when our perception of the Aztecs as being, the sort of very
yeah.
negative view of this savages
That's what kind of
really,
they really.
really
Yeah.
spreads and
And
takes root.
sorry for interrupting you, but that kind of when the quote rediscovery of Tenochtitlan happened, right? The archaeological evidence of Tenochtitlan happened when they found these pyramids, isn't it? So the revival of the Aztec Empire kind of started in. I'm sorry for interrupting again, but it kind of
Mm.
started with the archaeological rediscovery of the Aztec
Yeah.
in the 19th century.
Yeah, and then the birth of modern, archaeology and anthropology,
Yeah,
actually all of the intellectual disciplines or the academic disciplines, I think it's a kind of a one step forward, two steps back phenomenon. Is what happens
yeah,
is step forward. Oh, we're making new discoveries, finding new things now. I mean, the understanding of not just Aztec but Mesoamerican
yeah,
cultures, discovering texts. Let's just take it all the way through the 20th century, that now able to read glyphs, new things being discovered. But what our understanding is constantly up against, which then pushes it then back, is the virulence of this notion of Aztec savagery, which is there because it helps
Mm.
to justify European empire. So just think of how kind of just take the case of Mexico as like, oh, well, regardless of what you think about the Spaniards and their conquest, and of course the Spaniards are also being demonized by the Protestant
Yeah.
imperial nations, right? Everybody, all the Northern European empires, and then of course then the
Not to
United
say they weren't
States.
innocent by any means, by the way,
And you're
but
right.
yeah,
And the United States is kind of the heir of that. The kind of regardless of demonizing the Spaniards, the Aztecs are always seen as worse. And that actually connects to, events and ideologies that are being developed that are very much present in the 19th century. For example, US policies against indigenous peoples and Native Americans,
yeah.
removal, genocide, and so on. So it there are people who are saying, wait a minute, this isn't right, right? In the
Yeah.
19th century, it's like there are also countervailing ideologies. We can't really talk about a human rights movement yet, but there's countervailing ideologies that we can kind of see are the precursor to 20th century human rights ideas. And then, and what are they up against? This idea, no, 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 no. Indigenous peoples, Native Americans are not civilized, could never be civilized. Remember the Aztecs?
Yeah.
Look at the Aztecs. They become kind of the poster child for not just Aztec, not just Mexican or Mesoamerican, but indigenous, Native American
Yeah.
barbarity throughout the entire continent. And I think there's even a sense in which, you could kind of take this larger on a kind of a global scale because the demonization of the Aztecs can be found everywhere. And it it becomes kind of a trope
Mm.
for justifying
Yeah.
empire and arguing that some human races are superior to other
Yeah.
races. At some point, you can always go back. Well, look what happened to the Aztecs. Look at the Aztecs.
Mm.
Obviously, there are inferior peoples in human history, and it's much better if
Mm.
those peoples are, destroyed. So, I think the
Yeah.
implications when you start, yeah, I like your question about on why has our negative view lasted for so long on what's going on in the 18th, 19th, 20th century? How
And
can
it's
we track
still
that?
somewhat alive today as well in the 21st
Yes, yes. How
century.
can we track that up to the present day? Yeah, I mean, it's very much alive today. I would say, um, I said that there was a one step forward and two steps back.
Yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if that's what's going on now, and I've seen people making that argument. Like
Maybe
it's all
three
very
or
well.
four steps back.
Yeah, I think. What gives me some hope is the fact that this larger cultural setting of the 19th century is not the world we're living in today.
Yeah.
Now, if we see that change during the course of the 21st century, if imperialism
Mm.
returns um, in the way it did in the 19th century, and honestly, if you look at human history, there's no reason why we should assume that democracy will prevail and imperialism will be seen as bad throughout the world forevermore now. That there's no
Yeah.
reason to believe that. These things kind of go in cycles, and I think there's always the possibility that imperialism returns, and a lot of these 19th century racial ideologies come
I mean,
back to
see
the
this in
fore.
US, both in US and UK, especially right now, with the surge of right-wing ideology and everything coming back. And again, I'm not going to go into modern politics in this episode, but you kind of see this happening right now with the right-wing ideology coming back both in again both in UK and US and other places like Poland, for example. You see the right-wing ideology coming back very heavily, in fact.
Mm. You do, and when you really kind of dig in to that and read or watch the kinds of things that are being said by people
Yeah.
who are aligned with those movements, it's maybe surprising why the
Mm.
Aztecs come up. The Aztecs come up. They do. They
Yeah.
come up. And they say, "Yep, see, look, this was an example of
Mm.
an inferior religion, and we did the right thing. Thank God they were
Yeah.
conquered. You know, So it
Mm.
does have presentist implications. I think that's a kind of a
Yeah.
that's a it's a good moment. It's a good point to end to say when we talk about the Aztecs,
Mm.
we're not just talking about things that happened
Mm.
500 or 600 years ago. We're
But
talking about
also,
something that matters today.
but also, it's not just the Aztecs that have been viewed badly, pretty much up until now. With, the Mongols have been viewed as savages as well, or other empires. And the Ottomans, for example, has been viewed as savages, or like you said, the indigenous Native Americans, for example, has been viewed as savages and uncivilized. So it's not just the Aztecs or the Mayans, or it's every non-European civilizations has pretty much been viewed. And fortunately, it seems like modern scholarship is trying to change that. And yeah, I'm sure there were some bad aspects of this that we should acknowledge that happened. But
Hmm.
again, we should also compare to what Europe were doing at the same time, like we talked about in this episode.
Hmm.
So we should also compare to what's happening to other civilizations and not just think of the Mongols or the Aztecs, for example, as these brutal, uncivilized people who
Hmm.
were, just killing people for their own pleasure.
Hmm.
It's not really like that. It's not as black and white as people may think it is.
Hmm. Well, I look forward to hearing a
Yeah,
Mongol
yeah,
episode.
yeah.
I'll look for
But
a Mongol episode on well that
yeah,
aged well.
yeah.
Yeah.
I have made some actually, but I think we're gonna round it up there, and I just think I wanted to get my point across that that most Europeans kind of view other empires that we think of is in the stereotype. But before you go, of course, do you have anything you want to promote on the social media if people have further questions about the Aztec Empire? Or if people have, where can people read your books, for example, like the one I mentioned, when Moctezuma met Cortez, which I highly recommend because he talked more about how European history has preserved and viewed the Aztec Empire, and how in the aftermath of the fall of the Aztecs. It's a really fantastic book that people absolutely should read. And other books that you may have written on the Aztecs, or other books that may not be as related to Aztecs. You came up with one recently now about Elton John, of all people. So where can people find your book? Where can people find you if they have any questions about the Aztecs, or if people are just curious to know more about yourself
Yeah.
in general?
You can find me on my website is matthewrestall.com. Uh, you can find me through Wikipedia. My university emails are easily found, and I'm happy to take emails. And if you whatever your sort of favorite bookseller is, if it's Amazon, for example, and you just put my name, you'll get all of my books will come up in there, um, including thanks for the plug, Erwin, for When Montezuma Met Cortez. Yes, and I write about popular music as well. A book on Elton John just came out, and the book coming out in a few weeks on Christopher Columbus,
Oh,
called The Nine Lives of Christopher Columbus.
would rather
Um,
have you back for that one.
yeah, and happy to come back for that once you've had a chance to have that kind of pass
Absolutely.
across your desk. Yeah. Anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for the plug for my book, and thank you to those of you who are listening. And I look forward to coming back on Well That Aged Well. Um,
It's been a great pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And as always, I love talking about Aztec history. This has been What That Aged Well. We are available on social media under What That Aged Well on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky under What That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts as well. Podcast these days. If you're on Spotify, give us 5 stars if you like this episode. Also, check out some other episodes that were made. Check out our episode on the conquistadors, like I mentioned in the beginning. It's episode 139. So check out that one. We talked more about how the fall of the Aztec Empire, and we have made an episode with Jonathan Schwaller on the Aztec religion that you should absolutely check out as well. This has been with that as well. My name is Alan. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.